Okay, so this week our conversation is going to focus on, as the book discussed it, and as we will discuss it here, Scottish nationalism and the Scottish question. Right, one of the things that I think has been a theme over the course of our time together this semester has been the fact that Scotland, right, even in the throes of the British Empire, and even in the throes of obviously the Enlightenment and all that, right, there was sort of this streak of independence within it. For the people who are members of the Enlightenment, sure, yeah, they were not necessarily viewing themselves as distinctly different from their English counterparts, right? And in fact, many of them tried to become less, quote unquote, Scottish, right? They tried to speak in more proper English. They tried to be more more English in their speaking and in their writing. They called themselves North Britons rather than Scots. And for Scotland, right, there's also this sort of, love to hate England type of streak to it. There is this, for the Scots again, right, one of the things that is, I think, tough for Scots to justify in the 1700s and the 1800s is they really like being part of the empire, but they just don't like being part of the, quote unquote, English empire. And a quote that I've said multiple times before, and I will say again here, is, it's an English empire. It's an English empire, managed by Scots, right? It is the Scottish folk who are doing the sort of the day-to-day labor. It is the Scottish folk who are doing the heavy lifting in a lot of this, in a lot of these places. And by the time we get to the 20th century, right, Scotland is going to be bucking that system. Scotland is going to be struggling under the weight of two world wars, and Scotland's going to be struggling under the sort of financial troubles that impact the world. But there's also anybody here who has taken History 102 or taken any European history courses or taken any global history courses, right? You will know that in the 20th century, there are nationalist movements across the globe, right? I'm sure, particularly those of you who are history majors, right? Particularly those of you who are history majors, right? You will have heard of something called decolonization that comes across Europe, comes across the European empires in Africa and Asia in the late 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and Scotland will be part of that as well. So the British government has to justify that. The British government has to come to terms with that. Again, in Scotland, this will bubble up in this period. So when we look at Scottish nationalism, right, one of the things that Scotland understood about itself, and one of the things that we have come back to and discussed a lot over the semester, is really the economic strength of Scotland. One of the things to remember here is that Scotland was an industrial powerhouse, maybe a relative industrial powerhouse, and maybe one that was contingent on its powerful neighbor. But one of the things to be aware of here is that Scotland was relatively strong, right? You'll remember back to our conversation a couple of weeks ago where we called it the Scotland the world's workshop, right? The River Clyde produced something like 1/4 of all of the ships on the sea, right? It produced all of the ships that went out, to into the ocean, into the British Empire. Scotland provided a lot of men for the army and the navy, and obviously that money is coming back to Scotland. So it's important for us to be aware here, right, that Scotland's economic output is going to make it believe that it can separate from England and separate from the United Kingdom. So out of this, let me also say here, right, those of you who know anything about European or UK, anybody here who knows anything about UK politics more recently, right, you might remember that, a couple of years ago in 2014, Scotland had a referendum to try and become independent from the United Kingdom and break away from England. And there was a big debate over it, and ultimately it was not successful. And the reason it wasn't successful is because a lot of people were very concerned about the sort of financial viability of Scotland. And I think, so I think part of that is obviously something that was weighing on a lot of people here. And in the 19-teens and the 1920s, there is this growing sort of intellectual and cultural movement to try and have Scotland receive its independence. And there are a couple of groups that are a part of that, right? You have groups like the Scottish Home Rule Association, the Scottish National Movement, which is a literary movement, and the Scottish National League. All three of these are working sort of independently of each other to seek Scottish independence from Britain. Now, I will point out here, the Home Rule Association and the National League, they're putting their attention on more of the political process and trying to get people out to vote and trying to get people to understand, what home rule or Scottish, what the term that they're ultimately going to use is devolution. The national movement, I think, is really the part that's really fascinating, right? It's a part that goes sort of straight to the heartstrings of the Scottish nationalists, right? It's a movement to try and focus on sort of love of the country, this literary aspect, sort of this identity of Scottishness. So you have this growing cultural movement that's tied to literature. When the Great Depression strikes in the 1930s, 29 to, it starts in 30, this led more Scots to, it's a good question. So Eaton asked the question, who are some of these nationalist authors? There's a guy named Alistair Fraser, who's probably the most important or most famous. I'm blanking on others. Well, this is also the time period, if you remember back, if we think of this as literature and sort of artistic in terms of this, right? This is also the time period of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who I've mentioned before, right? So it's sort of those artistic, figures. I'm blanking on, there's two other authors that are important, and I can't think of what their names are. I'll find, I have them in my notes, so I'll come back and I'll put them up in a few minutes. One of the other things, go ahead, Alexander.
So do these movements focus, like, are not necessarily, I guess, pacifistic is the term, like, are they like non-aggressive movements, or they're sort of get physical and aggressive, or they have spurts, or they have offshoots that do reach these levels?
So you're asking the question, does this get violent like it does in Ireland?
Yeah.
It doesn't. So this is not like the Irish home rule movement that has the things like the Easter Rising or anything like that. It's more political. It's more It's more cultural. Not that, and that doesn't. That's not to say. That's not to say that Ireland is not. They're just different, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll talk about Ireland in just a second. I should also point out here that for Scottish people, even today, right? Like, and this is sort of a side note here to that, right? I mean, one of the things about Scotland, even today in 2022, is that there is a streak of Scottish nationalism, certainly today, that sort of asks the question, is the Queen necessary, right? Do we have to care about Queen Elizabeth II? But there's also a part of Scottish nationalism that sort of understands her significance, right? And as a result of that, right, I think there's a portion of people who are Scottish who, when they talk about Scottish independence, and this is true when the 2014 independence referendum was going on, that they would keep the Queen as their monarch. She would be the Queen of Scotland, but they would not be part of the United Kingdom. So it's important for us to see, right, there's, I think for Scotland, one of the ways that their nationalist movement is different is there are, the fact that Queen Elizabeth II is a legitimate queen of Scotland, right? You can sort of, there's a very good argument to be made, and it's made by a lot of people, that Queen Elizabeth was, or the Hanovers, or were never really queens and kings of Ireland legitimately. So I hope that makes sense too, right? So that there is this sort of monarchical nationalism as well. So when you have the Great Depression that strikes the world in the 1930s, one of the other, this sort of pulls in a lot of people into this idea of Scottish nationalism, right? Because the thought was, because Scotland was such a strong industrial powerhouse, if they were independent, they would not have to worry about this they would not have to worry about the problems of the economic crisis, and because they were tied to the British and the UK government, they do, and you ultimately wind up something with like 30% unemployment in the Central Belt. And I think this goes to Alexander's question from a moment ago, right? One of the things that comes up here in comes up in the 1920s, in the 19 teens, in the 1920s, is that there's a push for home rule in Ireland, so that for the Irish, right, they see themselves as breaking apart, and for Scottish people, right, this is one of the things that they push as well. So in Ireland, right, so Ireland, just to sort of give you a 2-minute history of Ireland, although we've talked about Ireland a little bit in the past, right, at least in terms of migration. So Ireland was stretching back as far as the 1500s, Ireland was a place where English landlords would go over, control portions of Ireland, and be sort of absentee landlords for most of it. And then in the late 1700s, there's more and more English control in Ireland. And by the time we get to about 1800, there is 1799, 1800, there is a revolution in Ireland, which gives the British the ability to come in and take over Ireland, so that it officially becomes in union with England and Scotland in the United Kingdom by 1800. We've talked about, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Irish potato famine, and we talked about the famine more generally in Northern Europe. And one of the problems that we saw, right, is that, one of the things that we saw is that, for Ireland, there are massive struggles that occur there, right? There's millions of people who die from famine and famine related illness. There are millions of people who move from Ireland to Scotland to northern North America to northern Europe more generally. And again, the population of Ireland has not recovered even yet. And as this is going on in the 1800s, right, more and more people are feeling disenchanted with the British Empire. And by early 1900, well, not even by early 1900, by the mid 19th century, there are movements for Irish home rule, and that is exacerbated once we get into the 1900s. And you have events like World War One, which draws Irish soldiers into the battle, and it makes people obviously again question the role of the British Empire. So much so that by the time you get to World War II, Ireland doesn't even participate. But during World War II, during World War One, there is an event called the Easter Rising, where where Irish nationalists storm into the General Post Office in the heart of Dublin, the capital of Ireland. They seize it. They're ultimately forced out by the British government. The leaders are executed pretty swiftly. And again, this is a way that the British sort of handle it just to get back to fighting the First World War. But when that occurs, right, there's the creation of a new political party. There's a creation of a nationalist political party. Oh, go ahead, Tanya.
Is this like I think was it when the Irish Republican Brotherhood, is that they turned into the IRA after the Easter Rising? Is that correct? Or are they two different parties?
So the Irish Republican Brotherhood does emerge in this period, but the IRA does not start until a little bit later. I want to say after World War II.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, but there are these different movements, militant movements, let's say. Sorry, Jeff, what your question is this after the formation of Sinn Féin? Sinn Féin starts predominantly during or in this Irish Home Rule movement in the wake of the Easter Rising. Tony, go ahead.
Yeah, so speaking on Sinn Féin, I recently saw on the news that I think they won, what was it, a plurality of votes in Northern Ireland. And it's like a big thing that like a lot of people are talking about online, because it's like leading to questions like, will Northern Ireland join the Republic of Ireland?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Yeah, so one of the things that I think your observation there is great, and they did win a huge number of seats. I don't know if I could be wrong here, but I'm not entirely sure if it's as far as a plurality, but they did win a lot more seats than many people anticipated, which but again, I'm not caught up on Irish politics as much as I should be, I suppose. But yeah, you're right about that. They did win a lot of seats. And Tony, did you see anywhere why that might be the case, that they won so many seats? What are people drawn to about them?
Well, from what I've heard is that Brexit, for example, where the vote for Brexit was that basically like England voted to leave the EU, and then Scotland and Northern Ireland both voted to stay within the EU while England voted to leave. So now Scotland and Northern Ireland are upset that they didn't get to stay within the EU.
Excellent. That's exactly right. For a lot of people in Northern Ireland, right, when Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland were in the EU, there was a fluid motion of people across the border, right? Both of them, both of them had open borders across each other. They used different currencies, right? Because Northern Ireland would use the British pound, the Republic of Ireland would use the euro. But if gas was cheaper in the Republic of Ireland, people would go across the border and they would buy their gas there. If eggs were cheaper north of the border, you'd go across and buy. There was a very fluid movement of people across the border. And now, obviously Brexit, where now you've got border checkpoints, that's made life a lot more difficult for those people. But anyway, by 1921, there's the formation of the Irish Free State, and ultimately the Irish Republic, the Republic of Ireland, soon thereafter. So within Scotland, at the same time, okay, so Alexandra says the DUP in Northern Ireland is actually threatening a power stall. There's no promise to the stability of this majority at the moment, apparently, because the balance hasn't been agreed. Interesting. So they're sort of holding up people getting into power until they figure out.
Yeah, they're saying basically the phrase that's been thrown around is Stormont or protocol right now. That's what they're saying. So traditionalist or nothing at all.
Traditionalist, like Irish party.
I think they want the continued structure of the Democratic Union Party staying majority. This is the first time in their history, I think they're majority since the Good Friday Agreement. Undoubtedly, they'll reach the balance because of the structure of Northern Ireland's politics. But right now, as far as yesterday, they were asking Johnson to intervene even. So it's curious to see what's going to happen.
Interesting. That's really interesting. All right. So for the Scottish sort of national question, right? For the Scottish national question, one of the things that emerges is, once again, sort of looking back at, the history of Scotland, right? For Scotland, there has, always been this pride of, sort of the past, right? And if you remember back however many weeks ago now, when we were talking about Robbie Burns and Jacobitism, right? One of the things that we read that all the way back then, and I don't expect any of you to remember those poems from all the way back, probably 10 weeks ago. But one of the poems we read was a poem by Robbie Burns that was called "Scots What Hey," and it was it mentions people like Sir Walter, William Wallace. It mentions Robert Bruce, and it mentions a lot of these sort of Scottish national figures, right? Even if you remember, we read the poem by Robbie Burns called "Charlie, My Darling," talking about Bonnie Prince Charlie. So there is always this sort of historical looking back aspect of Scottish nationalism, and that is what goes on here. So in the 1930s, there's a political shift that occurs for Scotland with the creation of a position called the Secretary of State for Scotland, and that role, right? That role was a way for more power to be given north of the border, and that power was given to a position where people would be able to. This Secretary of State for Scotland, right, was able to sort of petition for and use their leverage and their power to sort of, at least theoretically, fight for what would be good for Scotland. Now, obviously, this is politics, and what one person or one group of people think is good for a country may indeed not be as good as then one might think. But nonetheless, right, this is a way that Scotland was sort of tossed a bone, that they were at least given the impression of local administration and local control. And as you know from your reading, right, this was not always used exactly well, and there's obviously politics being played here. One of the things that I really find interesting here is that this is the period in the 1930s when there is the formation of the Wallace Monument. So we have not talked about William Wallace much at all, and I mentioned his name a couple of times, right? Braveheart and all that. But William Wallace is a famous character, a famous figure who is sort of mythologized in a lot of ways. He is a nationalist figure. He is a figure that in history, right? He is famous for fighting the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and and defending Scotland against intrusion. Again, a lot of it is mythologized. We don't necessarily know too much about his life. He's from a minor lord family. But in the 1930s, there's a major push to have a monument built for him outside of Stirling. So if anybody here ever goes to Stirling, right? So let me just show you where that is on the map. So Stirling, this map is a little blurry, which I apologize for, but Stirling is kind of in this area where my cursor currently is, sort of north of Edinburgh and Glasgow, sort of in the center of that just sort of northern central belt area. Sorry, there's a fly flying right here. So there's a monument that they want to erect called the William Wallace Monument. They go on a sort of national campaign to raise money for this. And throughout their campaigns, right, one of the things that they keep coming back to is this idea of nationalism and this idea of pride. So by the time we get to like the late 1930s, during the midst of economic crisis, the Great Depression, about 18,000 pounds are collected through subscriptions, through donations for the building of this monument, which is just a staggering sum of money, particularly for Scotland in this period. And some of it comes from people around the world, right? There's money. There are sort of expat Scots who are in Australia or Canada, North America generally, and they're sending in money. So they're making tons and tons, they wind up getting tons of money sent across for them to build this monument. It's ultimately constructed and it's finished in the later 1940s. And there's just tons of symbolism in it. The height is a certain number of meters or a certain number of feet, excuse me. There are busts on the inside of famous Scots. And again, it's sort of this, it's an image of, it's named for Sir Walter Scott, not Sir Walter Scott, sorry, Sir William Wallace. It is named for William Wallace. It's named for, it's in a place that Wallace was, so instrumental at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. But it's in many ways not just a monument to him, right? It's a monument to all of Scotland. And then you have this, again, these busts, these images of all of these famous Scots around it. Up until this point, right, from the 1920s, the 1930s, there is even, if we think back to the 1920s and the teens, right, one of the things that we talked about a couple of weeks ago was something called the Red Clydeside. I talked about it briefly, right? Red Clydeside was this sort of socialist movement that emerges in Scotland to fight for workers' rights in Scotland. Even that sort of has like a nationalist tone to it, right? And all of this is small scale. There's no real, no real political pressure behind it. Go ahead, Tony.
So yeah, in one of my other classes, a medieval class on violence, One case we were looking at was William Wallace. It was in a paper that was looking at the wider use of execution in England.
Okay.
And what was very interesting for me about William Wallace was that, like, they didn't just kill him and then like desecrate his body. That's not only what they did, because they wanted to make it look legitimate. So they had a court case where basically they had all of these laws where, like, if you were convicted of this law, they would remove your head, or if you were convicted of another law, they'd remove like your liver or something. So what they did was they charged him with like every single crime they could think of to remove all these different body parts, and then he was convicted, which then they said, okay, the punishment is now that we have to desecrate his body in a very disturbing way.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and if you are interested, there's you can read sort of just the awful things that they did to him, right? They whipped him, and then they made him walk, hundreds of miles from his imprisonment in Northern England down to London. He was stretched on a wheel where he had his bones broken. He was hung, and then he was drawn and quartered. It was just a brutal treatment. You're absolutely right about that, Tony. It was just a terrible way. I mean, not that torture is ever great, but they really made an example of Wallace. You're absolutely right about that. Thank you for bringing that up. So by the time we get through all of these different nationalist movements, right, one of the things that also occurs here is there's finally a political arm that is established. There is a political arm that is established to try and achieve more power to Scotland. And that political movement is called the Scottish National Party. So the Scottish National Party emerges in the 1930s. It's first founded in the 1930s, although it doesn't have really much power at all. Instead, right, it really is more of a force of sort of political organization. It's a way for people to sort of represent themselves. It's a way for people to align their sort of nationalist feelings with at least a political party. But after World War II, right, there's a lot of political changes that occur after World War II in Britain generally, right? One of the things that I always find really interesting, and again, anybody who has taken a British history course, or European, British history course, you might have heard that Winston Churchill, who obviously helps to lead, or I should say, who leads Britain through World War II, helps to win World War II along with the other allies, right? He loses an election in July of 1945, right? So like even the guy who like is the voice of the nation can't keep an election seat and does not become prime minister again after 1945. So it's important for us to be aware here. There's a lot of sort of political changes going on in Britain in the 1940s and 50s up through the 1940s. So the Scottish National Party starts to win some seats throughout Scotland in the 1940s, but their really first big win comes in 1967 when Winnie Ewing wins a huge election in 1967-68 and is sent down to Westminster as a representative of Scotland. This is a huge change, and this is a way that the Scots really start to come into their fore here in here in the 20th century. So the Scottish National Party is a merger of different parties and different political movements, and their formation really, again, sort of brings together a coalition of people, brings together working class folk, it brings together sort of those middle class professionals. It's a way to unite people of Scotland into a more cohesive political organization. Their goal, which, again, takes a long time, nearly 50 years to over 50 years to achieve, is a devolved Scotland. Basically, they don't want independence, right? Independence is not on the table. And it's important for us to be aware here that I guess I should address that here, right? I mean, it's important for us to be aware that Scotland was not looking to become independent. Scotland was not looking to break away from the United Kingdom. Not like they do in Ireland. But they do want devolution. They want Scotland to have the representatives for itself and to return those Scottish issues back to Scotland, right? The goal here is to, again, return things back to Scotland, so that you'll remember there are the big three institutions that are Scottish, right? The law, the church, and education. So that those things obviously have always been under Scottish control, but they want to move back even more, right? The sort of healthcare situation. They want to move back road maintenance and funding on infrastructure. They want decisions about Scotland to be made in Scotland. And the 1960s vote, the 1967-68 vote, when Winnie Ewing wins so many seats, wins her seat, and they win more power in the country, right? It's seen as a protest against the government. It's seen as a sort of a referendum on how the government was doing. And, I thought the book has this great quote, and I left my copy upstairs, but there's a quote in one of in the chapter that we're reading and discussing this evening, where they're talking to a Labour Party member after the 1967-68 vote, and he says something like, I'm just going to paraphrase, where the person said, "Oh, are you upset that they came in first in a couple of those places?" And he's like, I'm not concerned about the firsts. I'm concerned about the seconds, because they had come second place in 40 races, which meant that on a local level, they're coming, they're sort of getting close to that, right? The first ones, you knew that was going to happen, right? You knew that they were going to win in certain places. But those seconds, right, that means they're sort of nipping at the heel of that labor movement. And the Scottish National Party is playing sort of the middle ground, right? It's playing not just sort of the Scottish national side, but it's also sort of triangulating with the conservative side as well. So they're sort of stealing votes from both sides. And Winifred Ewing, again, Winifred Ewing is playing, it plays that role really well. She is a Glasgow lawyer. She comes from the Glasgow suburbs. She comes from Hamilton, which is a working class part of the Glasgow suburbs. Her family is sort of an industrial family who has sacrificed to have her become a lawyer. She is seen as really this emblematic figure who can lead this party and who can lead, who can help attract more attention to the Scottish national political scene. So again, she wins her seat in 1968, but the Scottish National Party wins 34% of the vote. Again, not a huge amount, not really any, a third of the vote, right? Doesn't give them a ton of power, but it gives them name recognition and it helps draw more attention to it. And again, this is the part that really sort of brings attention to this is the fact that this was a long held Labour seat, a seat that was controlled by the Labour Party for many, many years. So you have the economic troubles that are going on domestically. You have more concern over sort of Scotland's position within the British Empire and within the British government. And you also have another big problem that Scotland is trying to confront here, and that is that their empire is falling, right? The British Empire as a whole, is coming under attack by the late 1960s. By the late 1950s into the 60s. As I mentioned a few moments ago, there are massive nationalist movements throughout the world in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, right? The empires that were established in the 1980s start to crumble. The British are forced to give up India in 1947. They're forced to give up Ghana in 1957. They're forced to give up Kenya in 1963. So all of these different independence movements that emerge here in the 1940s, 50s, 50s, 60s, 70s, again, are putting more and more strain on Scotland. They're putting on more and more strain on British folks in general. And Scotland was starting to question its own. Scotland was starting to struggle with its own existence within the British Empire. Again, I think even though people in Scotland obviously know their history, right? It's difficult for, I think, people in Scotland to understand that, they were, at least theoretically, equal with England in the United Kingdom, right? Proportionally at least. But for the people of Scotland, right? I mean, it was still, people still called it the English Empire, and there was this sort of idea of their connection to England. And if the empire was no longer going to be this prominent piece, right? If they're sort of, if Ghana, or if Africa in general, or if India was not part of the British Empire anymore, the prestige had fallen. And Scots were starting to notice that. And Scots obviously are starting to look, out for their own interests. Again, there was something in the water that was going on globally, that there was a desire for breaking away from these empires. And the Scots experienced much the same. All these pieces, right, are part of this broader concern for the British government and the British Empire. In 1956, right, there's an event called the Suez Canal Crisis, when the British government controlled the Suez Canal, which is here in Egypt, and a nationalist government run by a former colonel named Gamal Nasser storms the canal and takes it over, creates a standoff between the British government and the Egyptian backers. And after the standoff, the British are forced to give up control of the Suez Canal. So what happens, right, is this again puts all of this into a more stringent reality, and it becomes a question of, what is the empire going to be like? What is, are we going to be able to sustain this? Is the empire worth being a part of? Remember, the empire and the Scots' place in it, or the empire and the Scots' administration of it, has been something that the Scots have always desired. And this was a major identity for the people of Scotland. So I have a document here that I want to read, and it's related to North Sea oil. So Scotland, right? Scotland, as we've talked about in the past, is not really a very, they have a lot of resources, right? But it's not a super rich country. You can't grow a lot of crops there. You can't produce a lot of things. In Scotland, the terrain is very rugged, so movement of goods is not super easy. But it's important for us to be aware here, right, that Scotland does have a lot of oil, a lot of coal, and a lot of iron and other items under the ground as mineral deposits. In the 1960s and 70s, Scotland, there is drilling for oil, and there's the discovery of oil off in the North Sea. And oil starts getting pumped out of Scotland and gets started shipped around Europe and around the world. The UK becomes a member of the EEC, which is sort of the granddaddy of the EU. The EEC stands for the European Economic Commission, and again, it's about access to oil and access to petroleum products. And one of the things that the SNP argues for very, very strongly is access to the rights of with the oil. So that the Scottish National Party is going to argue that again, you should have local access, local control of those British resources, of those Scottish resources. And this is still something today that people talk about. One of the reasons that Scotland, I think, thinks it can be independent from the British Empire is because of the North Sea oil, right? Oil has always been obviously a very lucrative resource, a very important resource. And the Scots obviously see their access to that as as part of that. So I want to have us look at this document, please. Sorry. So if you look at this document, so this document comes from sort of a white paper published in 1975 regarding North Sea oil, the SNP's views on it, and coming, a plan for nationalism. One of the things that Scotland is going to have in the late 1970s is going to be a vote for independence. It's going to fail utterly, but again, it's an attempt to try and have that independence here. So if you could please take a minute or two to read this document. We'll come back and we'll discuss oil and the Scottish role, that role in the Scottish independent ideas. In the 20th century. Oops, sorry. Oh, by the way, I looked up some names. So there was a Hugh McDaird, for those literary nationalists. Hugh McDaird. I wrote a list here once I couldn't type them anymore. Where'd it go? There was Hugh McDaird, Carol Duffy, James Brighty. So there are a few different authors from the early 20th century that are focusing on this push towards nationalism, push towards sort of looking at sort of Scottish idealistically. So I'll add those to the notes once class is over. So along with sort of the opening up of North Sea oil, you also have the success of the late 1960s Scottish National Party, right? There's other sort of ways that Scotland is starting to see growing focus on sort of their successes, right? One of the things that Scotland is doing very well here in the mid 20th century, again, is being a huge industrial powerhouse and a huge industrial player within Britain and certainly within the broader European context, right? So in the mid 20th century, there are huge infrastructure projects that are completed. One of them is the Forth Road Bridge, which is a huge bridge that connects north of Edinburgh across the Firth of Forth. So I'll just show you where that is on the map. So that's connecting here from Edinburgh across the Firth of Forth. And you also have the Tay Bridge, right? These two really big construction projects that are completed in the mid 20th century that are connecting huge areas of industry and commercialism and culture across vast territories, again, to try and increase sort of attention to Scotland. You also have new universities emerging, right? Those 5 universities that we've been talking about constantly throughout the semester, right, are still there, right? Glasgow and Edinburgh and St. Andrews are still the same institutions that existed back in the 1700s. But then there's also in the mid 1800s, Aberdeen, the 2 universities, King's and Marischal College in Aberdeen, merged together to form the University of Aberdeen. But then from that point forward, right, you have these 4 universities. In the 1960s, there is the creation of 4 new universities that are spread out across the country, right? So Strathclyde is in Glasgow, not too far from the University of Glasgow. You have the formation of Harriet Watt University, which is outside of Edinburgh. So now Edinburgh and Glasgow both have 2. And then you have the University of Dundee in sort of one of those big 4 cities, the city of Dundee. And then you have another university formed in Stirling. So you'll also, so if you look here, right, so, 2 here in Glasgow, 2 in Edinburgh, 1 in St. Andrews, 1 in Aberdeen, 1 in Stirling, which is here, and then 1 in Dundee, which is here. You'll notice, right, that all of these universities are maybe not in the Central Belt, but they're not super up into the Highlands. I mean, that will come later, and that by the 1990s there will be more universities. There's a university called the University of the Highlands and the Islands that will emerge. But at this time, right, there are more educated people, and there's investment into sort of the culture of Scotland, and there's investment into ensuring that sort of the future generations have access to higher education. So Scotland is on the global stage, really is again, it's not just the North Sea oil, it's not just this sort of growing nationalism, it's also this internal investment, this domestic investment that is emerging here in this period. And this, again, comes to broader sort of shakeups within Scottish culture. Scotland globally, I should say, well, not globally, in the Western world, and particularly in Western Europe, there is greater attention to, or less of an attention, I guess I should say, on religious observance and religious attention, right? So that by the time we get to the 1950s and 60s, there is growing secularization across Europe, right? So one of the things that is going to occur here is that there is going to be more, more of a focus on secular life, right? Attention, moving away from the churches, moving away from the church being the center of a person's life. If you remember back to a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about education within Scotland, one of the things that I focused on, and one of my major arguments was that Scotland's schools and Scotland's churches were living very much hand in hand, right? There was this large connection between the churches and the schools. Parish leaders, the leaders of the church, the leaders of the church, the parish ministers, were typically the most educated people in a village or in a community. And as a result, they were the ones who led the schools, and they were the ones who educated their flock. But by the time we get to the 1960s, 1950s, that is less the case, right? There is a growing education opportunities for people. There are people moving out of the rural areas. And again, globally, people are starting to ask the question, how important is religion to my life? So when you look at a place, when you look at Scotland by the 1950s, right, the proportion of church observance goes down quite substantially. So that by about 1956, church adherence is down to about 46%. And then by the time you get to the 1990s, church adherence is down to the mid-20s. The Catholic Church was even more in crisis, right? Catholicism had been very much connected to Irishness and those urban environments. By the time you get to the mid-1900s, those urban environments are becoming increasingly secular. So this, in places like Glasgow and Edinburgh and Dundee and Aberdeen, the Catholic Church is imploding in those places. And will never rebound. One of the things I think I've brought this up twice already this semester, and I'll bring it up a third time here. There are these massive sectarian problems, right? Problems between the different religions in Scotland, Catholicism and Protestantism. There are Catholic soccer teams, right? If you live in Glasgow and you are of Irish Catholic descent, you support the Glasgow Celtic. If you are Protestant living in Glasgow, you support the Glasgow Rangers. If you are a Irish Catholic person living outside of or in Edinburgh, you support the Hibernians. There are these different, there are these different sort of religious undertones to teams and team support. And, by integration, or at least by the attempted integration of Catholics into broader communities and broader society, that has attempted to bring down sectarian violence and sectarian problems, but it has not eradicated it. Today, even, right, there are often fights between different supporters of clubs, and it goes back, and the derogatory terms and the slurs they use are often based on religious issues. The sort of high point of this idea of secularization came in the 1960s, when the Catholic Church was welcomed into the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. They actually welcomed in members of the Catholic clergy, which again was a huge sign of sort of going across the aisle, quote unquote, pun intended, I suppose. Again, it was a way of showing their support and that they were all struggling with this new secular world that they were dealing with. as you get into the 1960s and into the 1970s, certainly the economic crisis that is going to strike the Western world obviously is going to hit Scotland. And one of the big things that Scotland is going to experience is even further reduction of their economic output. So let me just sort of put a global context here, right? So for those of you who maybe don't know or have not studied maybe US history or global history in the 1970s, right? By the 1970s, there is a massive economic crisis in the Western world, right? By the time we get to the 1970s, the investment that Western companies have put into other parts of the parts of the world have really caught up with them, right? So like the investment that the United States has made in Japan has now led to Japanese manufacturing outpacing and becoming more economically viable than manufacturing in the United States. The same is true in, in South America, Asia, other parts of Asia, and Africa. So for the West, right, by the time you look at the 1970s, manufacturing is moving to other parts of the world and out of Europe, out of North America, which I'm sure many of you have heard of before, right? And what happens here, right, is this begins sort of the Rust Belt movement. Well, because of that, in Scotland, this once industrial hub, the Clyde River, loses a ton of shipbuilders in 1971 alone. They lose 8,500 jobs. And as these jobs are flying out of Scotland, out of Western Europe in general, there is a push by these workers who are losing their jobs to follow these economic sort of leaders. And two such people are Jimmy Reed and Jimmy Arley, who are Marxist, socialist, communists, who are going to be pushing for more support being given to the workers and more attention being focused on the needs of the workers in their production. But again, all throughout this period, there is more and more attention being given to economic resources coming from outside of Scotland, outside of Western Europe, because it was cheaper for those production costs. And by the time you get to the late 1970s, the Industrial Relations Act, which is supposed to limit the control of unions, actually leads to more unrest, people being more disgruntled with labor relations. And there's a strike that goes on in different communities, particularly around coal mining, so that there is a 3-day strike of coal mine workers in southern Scotland, in Lanarkshire, and outside of Edinburgh, that leads to energy cuts. Again, these are all pieces, these are all ways that the people of Scotland are part of this sort of broader issue of labor relations and labor struggles that are going on in the 1970s. And again, as we talked about a moment ago, right, you can see here, right, I mentioned the oil crisis of the 1970s, and I mentioned it here as well. Tony, go ahead.
So, when I was writing my paper, one example of like what you're talking about is there was this company that owns one of the two shipyards in the River Clyde, and one of those ships were basically saying how the way they were going to make production cheaper in Scotland compared to China was that their strategy was cracking down on like unions, and he was
Right.
like, we need to stop these lazy union guys because all they do is like sit down in the union hall all day. And it was just very weird to me because like it was like odd to see such like an anti-union like speech like from like this company owner. But then I mean, at least in my own mind, I was thinking of like the political situation from like the 80s with like Margaret Thatcher
Exactly.
in that time. So it kind of made more sense, but it was extremely like anti-union, and he was blaming the union for like the company in Scotland not making money.
That's a great observation, right? I mean, and I think one of the big things globally, whether that's in the United States or in other parts of Western Europe and other parts of the world, right? There was this anti-union bent that occurs in the 1970s, right? Because one of the things labor unions had done really, really well at was protecting labor conditions, right? So that people aren't working in really dangerous spots, but also a push towards better wages, right? Living wages. And for in the 1970s and 1980s, as there is this economic crisis going on and jobs are flying to other parts of the world, one of the big arguments was, if labor cost could be reduced, right, would we retain some of these jobs? And I think, Tony, your observation there is a really, really good one. Thank you for bringing that up. So by the time we get to the late 1970s, we are starting to again ask the question of, should Scotland break away from Britain? And in 1978, there is a movement towards getting there is a movement towards getting a referendum on Scottish independence. And this is an act that is put out to request that referendum to occur. So if you could please sort of read this, and we'll come back a moment and discuss sort of what is their goal here in terms of, or I guess how are they rallying people towards independence? And then what is he talking about here about the benefits, right, of a more devolved independent Scotland? So when we look at Scotland, right, there is a 1978 Scotland Act, which is the response that we were just looking at, where they tried to get an independence referendum in 1979, and it fails utterly. Now, the reason that it fails is that there's something called the Cunningham Amendment, which said that you needed 40% of the electorate to vote in order for the motion to pass, right? So here's basically what it said, right? So let's say when all of the votes were tallied, 70% of the population voted for independence and a devolution. But only 39% of the people of the country voted. That means it would not pass. So you needed at least 40% of the general population to vote for independence, or I'm sorry, to vote in the election in order for the vote to pass. So it was a really high bar to have, and ultimately that would be removed in subsequent votes. So the one that happens in 1990, and then the one that happens obviously in 2014. The goal here, right, is to get a devolved power devolved power back to Scotland, give Scotland some of its own control. And because of the fears over, again, what our Lord Strathclyde was talking about here in the document we just finished, right? There was a lot of concern over what what Scotland would look like, and could Scotland afford to be independent? Again, the uncertainties of the 1970s, the uncertainties of the early 1980s led to a lot of those concerns. And there is a huge conservative swing into power in the 1980s. Labour Party loses a lot of seats. The SNP in Scotland loses a lot of seats. And it sweeps in Margaret Thatcher, right? So Margaret Thatcher comes into power and she goes on a massive deregulation streak, just like Ronald Reagan will do here in the United States. And it will, Margaret Thatcher, one of the things that she will do to Scotland, or a couple of things she'll do, she'll close all of the coal mines in Scotland. So that will obviously leave out a lot of people who have made their money, made their jobs off of coal mining. But it will also, she'll also put in a poll tax on the people of Scotland, basically a tax, just a tax on everybody's head. So again, these are all ways that the sort of labor movement, nationalist movement within Scotland will hit hiccups in the late 70s and 1980s. The final place we'll end there, right, is that Scotland does ultimately get its devolved powers. In 1999, the Scottish Parliament opens in Edinburgh, at the bottom of the Royal Mile, across from Holyrood Palace, the Queen's residence in Scotland, and it's still in effect today, right? In 1999 it opens, and 23 years later it makes decisions for Scotland. It takes care of healthcare, takes care of education, it takes care of infrastructure, takes care of a lot of different pieces because of that now. So Scottish nationalism has been in its ebbs and its flows. Scottish nationalism is, tied, I think, very much to the economic situation, obviously, as nationalist movements are. I think in the last 5 or 6 years, certainly with the Brexit vote from a couple of years ago, and now the Brexit outcome, right, now that the United Kingdom is out of the European Union, it would be really interesting to see when Scotland will have another vote, and if Scotland will receive its independence. Tony, go ahead.
So what I was going to say in terms of Brexit with with Scotland is that, so before, like, a big problem with Scotland, like, not wanting to leave the United Kingdom was because they were scared of being independent away from England. But at least it seems economically they would be better off in the EU rather than being with the UK, because the UK only gives them like economic unity with just England and North Ireland, where if they were in the EU, they would basically have the same economy, be included in the rest of the economy of Europe. So I think, like you said, another vote after Brexit might be completely different, where Scottish independence would win, because it might be more economically advantageous for them to be a part of the EU rather than the UK.
I think that's a really great point, Tony. I think you're absolutely right about the economic benefits, right? Also, like, one of the things that I know a lot of the people that I know in Scotland, right, one of the reasons that they voted to stay in the UK, so in 2014 was that vote, and then 2016 was the Brexit vote. One of the reasons that they voted no to independence in 2014 was they didn't want to be out of the EU, right? Because if they left the United Kingdom, they would be out of the EU. Well, that's not what they wanted. They wanted to be in the EU. And then the thought was if they, if they stayed in the UK, they'd be in the EU. Now, right now they're out of the EU, right? So why would they stay in the UK if that was the one benefit? So for a lot of people, right, these have become new problems. I think, I think it'll be an interesting, if it does come to a vote again, which Boris Johnson has said he will not let occur. It'll be interesting to see where it all comes, where it all falls down to. Eden, what do you mean by, is there any other things that had Scotland affect Britain during this time? What do you mean? Do you mean like do you mean that like why Scotland might want their independence more now? Well, I mean, I think if it's a question of economically, right, I think the housing bubble in 2008 certainly affected Scotland. And if they would have had more control over their localized banks, would that have led to more protection? So Eaton says, yeah, oh, is there anything that negatively affected Britain because of Scotland or anything? I think Scotland, since then, since 2014, has had other issues. But I think really the big thing is Brexit, right? A lot of people are disenchanted with Britain after the Brexit vote. And then to Alexandra, I think your point about Barbados and Jamaica having voted for independence is a really good one. Or Barbados having voted, Jamaica potentially voting, and then Belize will probably follow. I think that's a good. Those are good observations. However, those are a little different again, right? Like those don't have Scotland and England's connection is not really the same as colonial. Is not really like a colonial and parent country anymore, right? Like those places, they're former colonies, right? And I think their independence is a bit more likely. Scotland, I don't know. I mean, I think Scotland is moving in that direction. I don't see Scotland and England being tied together forever. I think you're right. They're going to wait until Queen Elizabeth is dead, certainly in the colonies or in the empire. And I think that's true in Scotland as well, because no one wants Charles to be king. But anyway, yeah, I think that's a great point. All right, so this is where we will come to an end. Your final exam is due next week on Tuesday evening. So I'm going to let you all have that time to work on your final exam. This is the last time we will see each other. That's not true. I will be here during the final exam period. I will sign on around 7 o'clock. I'll send you a more formal email next week. I will sign on at 7 p.m.